Campbell surprised me. When I decided to do this particular program, I was thinking more in terms of his singing than his life. But of course, to do these programs, I need to know something about his life. After I had done my reading and thought about it for a while, I decided that we had to call this one Fading into the Fog, because that's what happened to this man. This is his picture. He's Glenn Travis Campbell. He was born on April 22nd, 1936, and he passed away on August 8th, 2017. This picture is one of my favorites of his. It's a publicity photo, and it was taken in 1967. He was 31 years old when this was taken. He had made it in show business as a musician and as a singer for the first time. He had spent 7 years in Los Angeles working as a very successful studio player, and he was making a good living at that. But in 1967, Campbell recorded Gentle on My Mind, and everything changed. This is a quote from him. He said, "What became my first big hit was intended to be no more than a demonstration tape from which the musicians would become sure of their parts for the master recording. Because I didn't record the song in what I thought would be my final voice, I might unintentionally have incorporated a casualness that matched perfectly with the song's unusual arrangement." The year after this publicity photo was taken, 1968, another of his most famous songs, By the Time I Get to Phoenix, hit #1 on the Billboard country and pop charts. He recorded it as his follow-up to Gentle on My Mind. Both of these are different pieces because he found them. For the first time, he wasn't recording what others said he must record for them. Instead, he heard both of these at different times, and he decided he wanted to. And it was the first time he really breaks out and he starts selecting his own material. By the way, he found Woman, Woman, Have You Got Cheatin' on Your Mind? At the same time he found Phoenix. He actually liked Woman, Woman better. But his producer happened at the same time to be looking for a first song to introduce a new group. It was called Gary Puckett and the Union Gap. And so he asked if he might use it. So Campbell gave Woman, Woman to Gary Puckett, and he recorded Phoenix. I used 2 books for my research on this particular program. The first one is an autobiography by Glenn Campbell himself. It's entitled Rhinestone Cowboy. He published it in 1994. He actually finished writing it, my best guess, is between the end of 1991 and the beginning of 1992, and that'll become important later. His publisher was out of New York, and the book did very well. It was the first of 2 books that I selected to be able to review for this program. It's the autobiography, and I must tell you, it is raw. He spares us nothing from his impoverished childhood or his awkward teen years. During those teen years, by the way, he quit school in the 7th grade to play gigs with his uncle. He married his 15-year-old pregnant girlfriend. He was 17, and he buried his first child. All of that before he was 20 years old. The remainder of the book, his autobiography, catalogs his amazing career, 3 of his 4 marriages, the births of his 8 children, his nearly fatal addictions to alcohol and cocaine, and his recovery from drug dependency to, like the Phoenix, he rose up whole as a born-again Christian and well again. The second book I picked was entitled Gentle on My Mind, in Sickness and in Health with Glenn Campbell. The writer here is his 4th wife, Kim Campbell. They were married for 32 years till his death. It was published out of Nashville. It's the second book, but in truth, it's the second half of Glen Campbell's life story. It's the part of his life that he couldn't have written. It was the part of his life that only she could have written. It's brutally honest about the challenges that the two faced before and then throughout their marriage. The biggest ones were first his addictions. And when he got that under control, along comes a mental decline from dementia that took him away from his fans and from her. He was diagnosed in 2011 and he died 6 years later. Campbell's autobiography begins with his very earliest childhood memories, and it ends with his description of standing over his mother's grave in 1991. I think from my reading that he probably stopped working on this book late 1991, beginning of 1992. It was published in 94. That makes a difference, which you'll learn about a little bit later. Kim's book, Gentle on My Mind, it begins with her description of the first time she ever had a date with Glen Campbell. It was a blind date. She's 22, he's 45, and she's heard of him. She knows his name, but she doesn't know anything about his career. It turns out that when he was at the height of his career, she was 10 years old, so she kind of missed all that. The book ends with her description of Campbell's memorial service after his death in 2017. It was held at the Country Music Hall of Fame and was amazing, 300 invited guests only. It takes both of these books put together for you to get the whole of Glen Campbell's life. His autobiography focuses on his problems with wives, he wasn't very good at that, and his problems with addiction. And then it centers on his return to his faith, which is what helps him overcome the addictions. As he says, it reclaimed my soul for me. Her biography catalogs their love story. It's clearly the truest love story either one of them ever experienced. It also catalogs the personal growth that Glen Campbell underwent as a surviving addict. Kim's book does something else. It completes Glen Campbell's life story as she tells the story of the last 6 years of his life when he's battling with dementia. Unless you read them both and in order, you're going to miss the whole of the life that Glen Campbell lived. In probably what was the biggest understatement of his life, Glen Campbell said, "I grew up poor." Did he ever? Nearly everything that you read about Glen Campbell names his birthplace as Delight, Arkansas. That's how they say it, Delight. Campbell himself told people that he was born in Delight all of his life. The truth is he wasn't. He was actually born in Billstown. It's about 4 miles from Delight. You can see it on the map here. Billstown had one church and 2 stores and was almost never printed on a map. Thus, Delight got the credit. When he was talking about his poverty, his childhood growing up, in his autobiography, Rhinestone Cowboy, he wrote this: "The kind of poverty I knew as a boy wasn't really any kind of living. It was merely existing. We didn't just endure poverty, we wore it. You could see it in the distant, fearful stare of my parents. I was born in 1936 when the rural South was reeling from the Great Depression. In the city, poor people stood in bread lines and went to soup kitchens. There were no such luxuries in the Arkansas backwoods." This is a picture. It was taken in the early 1940s. It's of a sharecropper cabin. His father was a sharecropper, and so these are the kinds of cabins that the family lived in, that he grew up in. His descriptions are amazing when he talks about how very cold it would be in the winter and that he could see through the floorboards, the ground underneath. Very, very difficult conditions. His family was an interesting family. His father, John Wesley Campbell, he was a sharecropper, but when there wasn't a crop to do, he was a wood chopper. He hunted, and he was a general laborer. Essentially, this man did anything he could find to make some money for his family. He was a very devout Christian, member of the Church of Christ, and he was a very, very good singer. Glenn Campbell's mother was Carrie Dell Stone. She was a homemaker first, but she picked her share of the cotton, and she also did general labor when necessary. She shared with her husband the devout Christian faith with the Church of Christ and the fact that she too was a very, very fine singer. They had 12 children. All of the Campbell children were born at home. And Glenn talks about his mother would be back at work picking cotton 2 days after giving birth. There's 7 boys and 5 girls. Glenn was the 7th son and the last child born. All of the children would sit on a single pew with their parents at church, and they would sing together. All of them had incredible voices. The family worked hard, but music was their passion, and they were all talented. Fair warning, if you look at a lot of different things about Campbell's life, I looked at a number of biographical sketches online and some newspaper articles and so forth, and even his obituaries, you're going to quickly find, as I did, contradictory facts. One of these is exactly how many children the Campbells really had. Even Rhinestone Cowboy, his own autobiography, gives a different number in 2 places in the book. I finally found what I think is clarification. Mrs. Campbell, in her birthing, actually birthed 2 sets of twins. From each set, only 1 twin actually survived, so that takes away 2 of the children. Still, the most frequent number that's cited in the most reliable sources is that there were 12 children. There are other discrepancies too, but we'll work through those as we go through the program today. Campbell wrote this: "Perhaps the greatest damage to poor children is not being able to be kids. They are heaped with the responsibilities of adults before they're old enough to handle them. Their bodies become more developed than their minds, and neither has a chance to develop much. Dad couldn't wait for his kids to grow up. He needed us to pull our own weight. Dad spent much of his working life breaking the hard Arkansas dirt with a mule and a plow. The only time when Dad's yield increased was when one of his dependents left home." And as was the practice during that time, boys, when they reached a certain age, would run away from home. And then they would come back and they would be recognized, even if they'd only been away for 1 day and 1 night, they'd be recognized now as adults. When Glenn was just learning to walk, he already showed very unusual promise in music. The family had a mandolin that they played, and Glenn would walk around with it trying to strum the strings, but his little fingers weren't big enough to make chords. Glenn's father recognized that his youngest son had a superior talent, and he saved up $5 so that he could order Glenn a 3/4 size guitar from Sears Roebuck. Glenn got that guitar when he was 4 years old. When Glenn gave an interview to the Daily Mail in 2008, he talked about that guitar and his father customizing it for him. The guitar needed a capo, which is a device used to shorten the strings. Campbell said, "My daddy made me one out of a corn on the cob and a rubber band. All I ever wanted to do was play the guitar. Singing was a sideline, and once I had that capo in place, I didn't look back. This is a commercial capo. That's if you go to Amazon and order one, or to a music store, wherever they sell guitars or stringed instruments, you can find one of these. On the right is the only picture I could find of a homemade capo, which uses a pin and rubber bands. But if you can imagine a corn cob sitting where the pin is, that's what Glen Campbell's capo looked like. Campbell said that when his father recognized that he had this really unusual talent for playing, that he didn't brag about it exactly, but he talked about it with the rest of the family. And they were aware that this one child had a special gift. Campbell said toward the end of his life that if anybody in Arkansas had known the word prodigy, he would have been called a prodigy, but they didn't know it. His uncle, on his dad's side, Uncle Eugene Boo Campbell, was the very best guitarist in the Campbell clan until Glen came along. He showed little Glen how to make chords by putting his little fingers and stretching them and reaching the strings. And as Glen got older, he would skip school and go to Uncle Boo's house so they could play guitars together. By the time Glen Campbell was 8 years old, he and Uncle Boo had formed their own little band, and it played on local radio shows, in schools, and at church functions. In Rhinestone Cowboy, Glen says, "When I was 15, I quit school and left home with Uncle Boo to become a professional musician. He had learned that musicians make money in Wyoming. He thought we could play the nightclubs out there. That's all I needed to hear. No more farming and no more school, just making music and getting paid for it." Their first gig was playing in a nightclub, but for no salary. They were told that they could play and they would be paid whatever the tips in the tip jar were. The money wasn't all that great, but it was more than Glen Campbell had ever earned in his whole life. This marked the first professional performance by a man whose career would ultimately span 50 years. It also marked the first time that Glen Campbell was arrested. He was underage and in a nightclub where that wasn't allowed, so they had to leave that job. He loved his parents deeply, and he respected them for all the hard work both of them had done to rear their children. As he became successful, he thought of them more and more. And by the time he was truly successful, he built them a lovely home with, he said, heating and cooling so Dad won't have to chop wood anymore in the winter. And he also often invited his parents to appear with him and sing with him on his television show and sometimes in his engagements. They loved doing it, and so did he. He said, "With the first money I got, I built my parents a house back home, gave them a string of credit cards, and said, 'Go.'" Campbell never forgot where he came from. In his autobiography, Campbell wrote, "Our big dream of making it was short-lived. Uncle Boo and I were broke, unemployable," he's underage, "stranded, and farther from home than either of us had ever been. We dug ditches." This is a picture of Dick Bills and the Sandia Mountain Boys. It's a group. They played often at the Club Chesterfield, as you can see in the picture. And Campbell played guitar in this band. This is another uncle of his. I've got a red arrow there that shows which one is Campbell, and he looks like a child because he's only 15. After they had tumbled around looking for work anywhere they could get it and playing wherever they had a chance, they ended up eventually, Uncle Boo and Glen, in Albuquerque in the early 1950s. And it was in Albuquerque that Campbell joined his other uncle's band, the Sandia Mountain Boys. Glen appeared in local television and radio too, because his uncle actually owned a radio station and had a television show. He eventually, in 1958, formed his own band. He called it Glen Campbell and the Western Wranglers. And he was earning the reputation of being a good band leader, but a superb fill-in guitarist. In Albuquerque, Campbell became a regular singing at the Chesterfield Club as a nightclub singer. He was also appearing, as I said, on television and radio. And for the first time, because of that kind of exposure, television and radio plus playing regularly at the nightclub, he had fans who recognized his music and knew his name. He was earning $80 a week, too, the most he'd ever earned in his life. It was quite a heady experience. He's only 15. Something else happens in Albuquerque. He has a love affair. A pretty young girl frequently came to the nightclub with her mother to hear Glen sing, and he noticed her. This was the first time that Glen Campbell had actually been this long, this far away from his core family, and he was lonely. The young girl, Diane, was smitten. They began dating, and she was his first girlfriend, and before long, at 15, Diane announced that she was pregnant. This is a picture of Glen Campbell with his daughter, Debbie. It was taken in 1956. It's interesting to know that Debbie, when she was an adult, became an excellent singer, and she sang backup for her dad. So she became part of his group. Campbell wrote about the pregnancy. He said, "Diane's pregnancy changed me from an aging child to a young grown-up. It eliminated forever my carefree days of adolescence. I had barely been able to provide for myself, and suddenly I was expected to provide for 3. My terror was exceeded only by my guilt. The only thing I felt I could do to redeem myself in the eyes of God and society was to do the right thing by Diane and marry her." The marriage was doomed from the beginning. For one thing, Diane's mother refused to give permission for the marriage. And of course, parents had to at that age for a 15-year-old. She never forgave Glen Campbell. Her father liked Campbell, and he decided the marriage should take place. And so he stood with Campbell when the two were married by Justice of the Peace. The baby, a son named after Glen, Glen Travis Campbell Jr., died just 2 days after birth. Diane's father had to pay for the funeral because the young couple didn't have money to cover that. Glen and Diane tried. They did have a second child, the daughter you've seen the picture of, Debbie, but the marriage still crumbled, and they divorced in 1959. Campbell wrote, "I had dropped out of school and left my home. I was living the stories about which the country songs are written. It didn't help that I was singing many of those tear-jerk ballads to throngs of equally lonely people. I had undergone a 2-year crash course in enough misery to last a lifetime. But I would find there were many more heartaches down the line for Glen Campbell from Billston, Arkansas. Many more." In 1959 also, just shortly after his divorce was final from Diane, Campbell met Billie Jean Nunley. She was a beautician from Carlsbad, New Mexico, who'd recently just moved to Albuquerque. Campbell asked her to marry him only a few weeks after he met her. She wouldn't give him an answer immediately, but eventually she said yes. And so in September of that same year, 1959, they were married in Las Vegas and returned to Albuquerque to begin their life together. A friend of Glen's who played steel guitar in the bars around Albuquerque had a collection of tapes by Django Reinhardt, the world's foremost jazz guitarist. Glen absolutely loved them. He listened to them so much that his friend suggested maybe he ought to go to a radio station and get a set of tapes made for himself so he wouldn't wear out his friends. Campbell wrote this, I was consumed by Reinhardt's chord changes and arrangements and tried to analyze and reproduce his techniques. I strained to hear every detail on the scratchy recordings which had been made in the late 1930s. The quality wasn't good, but nobody cared. Reinhardt was a guitarist's guitarist. I focused only on guitar, determined to become the world's best player. Singing for me was only incidental. If someone had told me then that my biggest hit records would be vocals, I would have been astonished and probably disappointed. Encouraged by others, Campbell and Billy moved to Los Angeles in 1960 to live the dream. Because of his impressive talent playing the guitar, Glenn found work easily. He got a job in October of that year with a group called the Champs. They were headed by two pretty talented guys named Jimmy Seals and Dash Crofts. They later became Seals and Crofts. Hal Blaine, who was drummer and a key member of a group called the Wrecking Crew, said this: he, Glenn, was one of those guitarists who could hear a part once and he had it down pat. Arrangers just loved that he could play off-the-wall solos, just the wildest sounds you have ever heard. It's important to realize Glenn Campbell could not read music, nor could he write music, but he could play anything that he heard. He had an ear. He played by ear. He quickly became a member of a very respected team of instrumentalists only, known as the Wrecking Crew. And this was when his career as a guitarist really took off. I looked up who's the Wrecking Crew and found this. The Wrecking Crew were a group of all-purpose, highly revered studio musicians who appeared on thousands of popular records, including massive hits such as Mr. Tambourine Man by the Byrds and California Dreamin' by the Mamas and the Papas. The instrumental work by this group defined the sound of popular music on the radio during the 60s and the early 70s, meaning the Wrecking Crew can reasonably lay claim to being the most recorded band in history, and Glenn Campbell was right in the middle of it. During the 60s and 70s, Los Angeles producers needed reliable, standby musicians who could be counted on to contribute to records in a variety of styles and deliver hits on short order. The Wrecking Crew were musically versatile performers who were usually brilliant with sight reading. Hal Blaine later coined the name The Wrecking Crew for his group. In 1990, in his memoir, he said, "The name was an ironic reference to the complaints of the older musicians that these young studio performers were embracing rock and pop and were thereby going to wreck the music industry." He had arrived, and he was where he wanted to be. He wanted to be a guitarist. He wanted to be a musician from the very beginning. Remember, he said that for him, singing was incidental. In those early years in Los Angeles, he and Billy had a child, a daughter, Kelly Glenn. He worked during the day at a song publishing company, and he also tried his hand at writing a song. He co-wrote "Turn Around, Look at Me" with Jerry Capehart. He played rhythm guitar for Frank Sinatra's "Strangers in the Night," and he recorded "Amazing Grace," and he added bagpipes at the end, which he played himself. That song would be used to close his live television show for 20 years. It was, he said, his favorite song of all time. In 1964, he played lead guitar on many of Ricky Nelson's hit records. And he went on tour for him for, I think it was a little over a year, and really enjoyed working with Nelson. He also was hired to replace one of the Beach Boys. He had been playing backup with them. He'd been doing his Wrecking Crew business with them. And then one of the Beach Boys actually became sick. And so he became a Beach Boy, and he toured with the group for almost a year. He wrote in his autobiography, "The first half of the 1960s were among the most dramatically eventful days of my life. I had started the decade as an unheard of pauper, and by its halfway point, I was earning a six-figure income. I had also earned a good reputation among the very best musicians in America." Campbell wrote, "I did extensive recording studio work throughout the 1960s until my own career as a soloist took off in 1967. He enjoyed working as a studio musician. Again, because he was with the Wrecking Crew, he was getting to play for the best, the finest who were recording. He also, at this time, got a couple of motion picture parts. And he got them, he said, only because he could play the guitar and they needed a singing cowboy. Or at least someone who could play the guitar and do a little singing. He was cast with Roddy McDowall and Phil Harris in The Cool Ones. And then he played in Baby the Rain Must Fall with Steve McQueen. He also got some television work. And this time he really got to sing quite a lot. He was on the Dick Clark Show. He was acting only in the FBI. And then he got a gig with a popular network musical variety show called Shindig. And there he got to play guitar behind Tina Turner, Marvin Gaye, James Brown, and Diana Ross and the Supremes, among others. In Cowboy, he talks about the moment he realizes he may need to sing besides just play the guitar. He wrote, "Driving to a recording session at Capitol Records, one day I was listening to a Los Angeles country music station and heard a low voice singing a song called 'Gentle on My Mind,' and it really stuck in my mind. I recorded it, and it burst out of the chute. That song changed my life in more ways than anything would until I became a summer replacement for the Smothers Brothers television show." "Gentle on My Mind" by Capitol. It was amazing. And then he did another one, a little follow-up that he particularly liked. He recorded "By the Time I Get to Phoenix." And then he recorded "Wichita Lineman." And then he recorded "Galveston." He wrote about this amazing collection of wonderful hits this way: "I had 4 major hit songs in little more than a year. Those 4 held the #1 slot for weeks on the country and pop charts. My biggest dreams had come true. And at the end of 1968, I had 4 albums listed in the country and pop top 10. The year before, I'd won 4 Grammys, and the next year I would sell more records than the Beatles." May 21st, 1969, Glenn began hosting his own television shows called the Glenn Campbell Good Time Hour, and it was produced by the Smothers Brothers. The first show, I love trivia, and this is one of my favorite ones about Glenn Campbell. The first show was sponsored by McDonald's, the fast food chain. And on that program, they ran their first ad for their newest product, the Big Mac. The television show was a hit, and it ran from 1969 through 1972. Also in 1969, Campbell is offered a starring role as an actor with John Wayne, Ken Darby, Wilford Brimley, and Robert Duvall in True Grit. Campbell was so enamored of John Wayne, he had watched him infrequently when he was growing up. Occasionally he'd see a movie and he would see Wayne on the big screen and just thought he was the best thing ever. And now he was going to be in a movie starring with Wayne. So he not only memorized his own lines, he memorized the whole script. So he knew what everybody was supposed to say when. The song True Grit was the only country song ever nominated for an Academy Award, and True Grit was the only movie that John Wayne ever won his own Oscar for. Campbell became good friends with the cast, especially Wayne, and in years afterward, he would visit Wayne at Wayne's home and they would drink and talk. His next film was Norwood with Kim Darby, Dom DeLuise, and Joe Namath. These are the movie ads, posters for these two. Notice it's sort of the same. One says it's Good Time Glenn and Super Joe doing what they do best, and the other one says exactly the same thing. And this is for Norwood. It's a very, very interesting combination to have Joe Namath and Glenn Campbell co-starring in the same movie. Campbell didn't like it. He wrote, "I played Norwood Pratt, a dumb old country boy. Pratt was a hayseed whose big dream was to get on the Louisiana hayride with a pet chicken standing on his guitar. It was a ridiculous story that set back the cause of country music and perpetuated every stereotype of country music as hicks." In the middle of this burst of wonderful opportunities, movies, hit songs, record-setting albums, Grammy Awards, selling more records than the Beatles, for heaven's sakes, fame and the pressures of work took their toll on the marriage. Something had to give, and Billy did. He tried, and so did she, to mix fame with family, to find a balance, but they couldn't do it. They actually had 3 children. They'd already had Kelly Glenn, and then following came William Travis and Wesley Kane. In 1976, when Kelly was 14, William was 10, and Wesley was 7, Billy brought in action. They'd been married 16 years. She received 1/2 of all of their community assets. Why did they divorce? Both of them said they just couldn't handle marriage and fame at the same time. There wasn't room for both. This is a picture of the 2 of them with the 3 children in happier times. They tried. Glenn had always been a drinker, but by now he had become an alcoholic. Among country stars, drinking and partying were a way of life, and partying usually meant chemical substance abuse, drugs. And this was very prevalent among the stars who appeared with him on his Good Time Hour. Johnny Cash and Roger Miller, for example, both ate amphetamines. He tried that one time and didn't like what it did to him. So he decided he'd use cocaine, which he did for many, many, many years after. He wrote, "I was drinking and drugging now to ease the pain. The abuse was fuel to the flame of my life, which was burning hopelessly out of control. Even so, there were some things that were good about the 1970s. 1974 was when Campbell discovered another song he felt the need to record. That song was to be his biggest hit of the decade and was the biggest hit he ever had in foreign countries. What was the name of it? Rhinestone Cowboy. It topped the U.S. country and pop charts in 1975, and 2 years later he found another one, Southern Nights, another hit that topped the U.S. country and pop charts. Then in 1977, he was on top of the world. Campbell said later that the 60s and the 70s were a blur. He didn't have memories of a lot of things that he did because he was high, he was drinking, and he was drugging. Songfacts.com wrote this in a review. For Campbell, Rhinestone Cowboy was a very important song and one he would call, quote, maybe the best song I've ever sung, close quote. It came at a time when his career had gone flat. His popular television show had been canceled, his acting gigs were drying up, and he hadn't had a hit since 1971. The story of a faded star who perseveres in the song held a lot of meaning for Campbell at this time. He picked Southern Nights because it reminded him of his native Arkansas and his rural childhood there. His arrangement of it had been recorded by others, but his arrangement became a huge hit. He said when he was asked about Southern Nights, "My dad told me when I was a kid that I was having the best time of my life and I didn't even know it." Sure enough, he was right. Now I really feel the need to go back home, float down the Missouri River, and fish for bass and crappies. It's real peaceful and remote from things like telephones. My head is still there. So is his heart. Without missing a beat, Campbell marries for a third time in September 1976. This time it was to his best friend, Mac Davis's ex-wife, Sarah Barg Davis. Campbell told People in an interview at the time, "I can't be alone. We're going to get married as soon as the papers are in." They had one child named Dylan, but the couple later divorced in 1980, just 3 weeks after Dylan was born. Campbell described the marriage and the relationship this way. "Tragically, Sarah and I centered our life around cocaine. Sometimes we did it day and night, at home or on the road. We would get so high for so long that we thought we couldn't get any higher. Then we would get strung out, exhausted but unable to sleep because the cocaine was activating that part of our brain that would have allowed sleep." After this third divorce, Campbell's drinking and his drugging got much worse. He began performing drunk or performing high. Sometimes his performances became incoherent. The fans noticed. Obviously, the tabloids noticed. Ironically, Campbell got more fan mail during this period because he was getting fan mail from others who were fighting addictions themselves. And once again, typical for him, he makes things worse. He starts an affair with Tanya Tucker. She was something. Although they didn't marry, their affair was the most widely publicized of any relationship or marriage that Campbell would have. At one time, they set a wedding date, but never went through with the wedding. Tucker was 22 years younger than Campbell. Their affair lasted only 15 months, but if you would look at the amount of material that was written about it, you'd think it surely was 15 years. They fought physically. She even broke one of his ribs with her fist once. They also fought emotionally, and they both abused cocaine regularly. Campbell remembers this. He writes, "By the middle of 1981, I had enjoyed as much romance as I could stand. 3 divorces and a broken engagement will have that effect on a man. Instead, I dived headlong into my music. I decided to record more in Nashville and less in Los Angeles." And that's when he had a blind date with a young woman named Kimberly Woolen. He was 45, she was 24. He was a worldwide celebrity. She was a dancer beginning at Radio City Music Hall. He had fallen away from his faith. She was grounded by hers. He was an alcohol and drug abuser. She would have an occasional glass of wine. He played guitar and banjo. She played piccolo and flute. They met in May. In December, he asked her to marry him, and she said yes. I love this picture of the two of them because they're obviously very happy. That's not the truth for the entirety of their marriage, but it was true for the majority of their marriage. Theirs was a love match, you see. There were difficult years, but they remained devoted to each other through it all. They had 3 children, Cal, Shannon, and Ashley. Around 2009, Kim began noticing changes in Glenn. He was forgetting things, and he often became confused. He began forgetting lyrics to songs he had sung for decades. They had to have cue cards for him when he performed. And he began doing something else. It bothered her. He began physically following her around. Everywhere she went, he would walk about 3 steps behind her. One day she decided to test it, so she walked around the island in their kitchen of their home 5 times, and he walked around 5 times right behind her and never asked her where they were going or what they were doing. Then she went out to the pool and went around the pool 15 times. He followed her again, never asked her what was going on or where they were going. 2 years later, he was officially diagnosed, and he announced publicly that he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. This was the beginning of a great challenge for the couple. For him, obviously, because he was the one for whom the disease was taking hold. Her, because she was his primary caregiver. This is a picture. They were appearing together. They went to Washington, D.C., and they advocated for Alzheimer's research. He did this before he died. He also released 3 more albums in that 6-year period: Ghost on the Canvas, See You There, and Adios. And he and Kim made the decision together at the point of the diagnosis that they needed to film a documentary about the progression of the disease, because that would show people that just because you're diagnosed with this disease, that doesn't mean that you stop living, or you should be someone to be afraid of, or you should be locked away in a closet. You could still do things, and he certainly did things. They went to visit Jane Seymour and her husband. They were producers, they were actors obviously, but they were also producers of documentaries. And they had recently done a rock documentary that the Campbells had seen and liked. And so they visited them and talked to them about the possibility of assigning a crew to simply go with Glenn and Kim to all these places he intended to go. He wanted to have a tour, a farewell tour. So the third thing that he did before his death, released a documentary entitled Glenn Campbell, I'll Be Me. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece. This is a picture of the two of them after he has done most of his tour. His mental state declined. It would come and go. The odd thing was, every time he would step on stage in front of an audience, he would become himself again. And that worked until just the last about 18 months, when finally he would be performing and he would be in the middle of a song, and then he'd just stop singing and go over and get his coat and put his coat on and basically leave. The audience knew, because of the promotions of his farewell tour, what was going on. And so they stayed with him. They applauded him for the courage. In August of 2017, at age 81, he passed away. The next day, he was laid to rest in a very private funeral in his hometown of Delight, Arkansas. He was laid to rest by his mother and his father and his firstborn child, the son. The death announcement from the Campbell family read this: "It is with the heaviest of hearts that we announce the passing of our beloved husband, father, grandfather, and legendary singer and guitarist, Glenn Travis Campbell, at the age of 81, following his long and courageous battle with dementia." This is the tombstone. And you see it already has Kimberly's place marked with her birth date, but not her death date. You've got 2 books. You have one life. One book, published in 94, gives you his version of what had happened until the 90s, the early 90s. You have her book, published in 2020, which tells the rest of the story. His book was an honest appraisal of his life. He talked about the drugs. He talked about the alcohol. He talked about his loss of faith and then finding it again. Hers is an honest appraisal of his life based on, first, the stories he told her about his childhood and his early career, because remember, she was a baby. Also based on what his friends shared with her, because they'd been with him through some of those tough times too. And then what she had personally witnessed as he tried to destroy himself with alcohol and drugs, and then shortly thereafter when Alzheimer's tried to destroy him. She helped him to recover his faith and to recover his health. One of his brothers and sisters-in-law actually moved into Glenn and Kim's home and stayed 5 years just to help her take care of him, not when he was having the mental decline, but when he was having such a ferocious time with his drinking and the drugs. He became physically violent. He was very difficult to handle, and the brother stepped in and protected her. This is one of the last pictures of Campbell when he could still play his guitar. He's aged. She also helped him, though, with the single greatest challenge that he was to face, and that was the dementia. Her book is hard to read, the final third, because it's that third that talks about in detail exactly what the decline from this disease is like. They hired help and tried to keep him at home for as long as they absolutely could, but he began wandering in ways. He was smart. He could figure out how to get out. He'd climb out of windows or into windows. He'd climb into the windows of neighbors' houses because he couldn't remember which house was his. It became untenable. The doctors finally intervened and said that it was no longer fair to him or to Kim and the others to keep him at home, that only a professional mental care institution would do. He lost his ability to play the guitar or to speak, but until the day he died, he recognized Kim. Rest in peace. You know, his life, if you think about it as a whole piece, is remarkable. He is a child prodigy with music, and he's got the gift of being able to hear music and then replicate it either with his voice or with an instrument by ear. He doesn't have to learn music as such, doesn't have to read it. He gets caught up in the whole Hollywood scene. He becomes a victim of alcohol and drugs, which almost all of them did. He overcomes it. He has a few good years, and then the mental disease attacks. That's a long life. That's a life that's rich, though. He left us wonderful music, and I'm so glad.
That makes me tend to leave my sleeping bag rolled up and stashed behind your couch. And it's knowing I'm not shackled by forgotten words and bonds and the ink stains that are dried upon some line. That keeps you in the back roads by the rivers of my memory. It keeps you ever gentle on my mind.